why not let's make it a bit informal. So the intention of this session is to, we have VSS, we have had a lot of discussion, introduction to what the VSS is here. We also have then VSC, which is the service catalog, and in the description of the event, or this, let's see how long time is planned for, 1 hour. Understand and define the relationship between VSS and VSC and how it moves forward. And I'm Erik Jaegervall, working for Bosch in Sweden. Stephen Loris is around, he will come soon as well. And we are not having that much of a strict agenda here, so it's a little bit to get your input, ask questions, but also discuss a little bit what's actually happening. And I'm mostly working with VSS together with some other people here that typically participate in the weekly meetings, like Gunnar, Sebastian. We have Ulf that also working with this, which is closely related. And then we have on the VSC track, we have Tim over there with a nice beard that is the one now driving much of a VSC topic. And so if I just start a little, what is VSS, VSC similarities, differences as I see it, and this is what I just wrote down actually early this morning. That, and I don't, have all of you been part of the VSC presentations, more or less? The VSS, the VSC presentations that where Tim has been talking. Have you been there as well? Not all? No, we can, but if we look at the top level, we have VSS that is, in short, a data meta model, where we have, well, signals. They can be sensors, something you read, attributes, something that you also read but typically never change, and actuators that typically can change. And an actuator could be like move a window forward, downward. In VSS, the core VSS itself doesn't really say what and how you can handle these parts, like set, get, and, for instance, subscribe. It's often implied that you can subscribe to something, like if you want to know the window position or the seat position or the speed. But VSS in itself doesn't say anything about subscription, because that's an implementation topic. But that is part of other implementation, like this. Oops, what's coming? Oh, the infamous cookies are not disabled. Jetzt verbinden. Und herzlich willkommen. And if we continue looking a bit about difference to VSC, in VSS I say it's just a data model. In VSC, there we have a lot of methods and API on how to do things. And actually you could see this about the idea of having set, get them, subscribe, like we have in, for instance, in this, which is the standard defined by W3C, where Ulf is the most active, I would say, where you specify how you can use a VSS model and get and set and subscribe using MQTT, WebSockets, HTTPS. That's a particular use case, like typical, like, well, I would say cloud-oriented, maybe not inside a vehicle, but this could actually be seen as a form of a VSC service to work on data points. It provides a number of services that you could do. Coming back to VSS, what we have as of today in VSS as itself, and also related to this, is that we don't specify things like error messages, authorization, because it's just a data model. It exists for this, And as I said, this is a particular use case, maybe not intended to be used that much internally in a vehicle, even if you, of course, could use MQTT and WebSockets internally as well. Hierarchical orders, well, in VSS, it's branches. You have this like vehicle.transmission.something. And if we then come to VSC and do a comparison, VSS data model and the big catalog today of VSC, well, I would say so methods API, how you define methods of services. I think this one is moving away somewhere. Yeah. But it also have ambition to go a bit deeper on this, like how do you handle errors? So in VSC as of today, similar to what there is a list of potential errors like arguments out of range, you're not authorized to do something, because that, yeah, VSS is just a data model in itself. There we don't specify anything how you want to do it, but you might want to do it, and that is something that we will, if nothing else, come a bit maybe later when we discuss things like layers. In VSC as of today, they have hierarchical order by namespace. It gives you a possibility to structure them, but so far, since we just have like an example service there, it's the practical way if we are going to sort of try to standardize services as well, because VSC, as I see it, is two aspects. One is the actual, the syntax, the infrastructure to be able to specify services, and the other is if and to what extent there should be a standardized catalog. And the question is if we are going to have a standardized catalog for something like, let's say, food updates, then the question is how should that be handled from a namespace perspective. And Tim, if I say something wrong about VSC, please fill in. And I will use this, as I said, just to get started, and then we can get discussed. So do not see this as the official viewpoint of Covisa. Then you need to talk to Paul or someone else to get that. But it's a little bit about what I see, that when we come with VSS and VSC, well, what is the difference, and when do you actually need a VSC and when do you need VSS? As for today, VSS is very much for individual data points, like you want to get vehicle speed. And that is quite straightforward. You want to read it, you want to subscribe it. But as soon as you come to more things that are a bit more complex, where you have multiple things that are interdependent, where you have things that doesn't really can be changed instantly. A potential example is move a seat to a wanted position. A seat, you have multiple. You have vertical position, horizontal, you have a recline. You have a lot of different settings there. And cannot be set instantly. So you can't just use VSS and set them one by one, the different items you want to change, because first of all, they are a bit dependent. You can't have your seat as far back as possible and at the same time have maximum recline, because then there will be no place for it. It also takes time, and that might be something that blocks. Like if you have a window moving up and down, if someone have a hand in the door, you can't, close it. And then with VSS, with a standard implementation of today, it sort of just gives a reply that says, okay, or not authorized, if we look at how this has implemented it. But it doesn't give you this more of detailed information of, why didn't it work? And there VSC can be more like context specific. Potentially VSC, we have discussed that you should both have a possibility to get one reply when something has been done, either accepted or not, but also like if you take a window moving example, that you should get sort of a stream of information of how does actually this window movement proceeds, and then potentially in the end, if it hasn't succeeded in some time, either because let's say the window is frozen or something that in the end that you have some form of report or error or of a timeout that it didn't work out. And if we look, either if you are working, let's say, from the cloud, let's say an app, you want to control something on, well, your window, your seat, your horn, something, or inside the vehicle, like you are developing a feature or functionality there, if you can have some things that are related to, that easily can be managed by VSS, both by reading, but also in some cases when if it's something that's easy to set, like for instance, I want to reset the trip meter. That is something that most likely you will succeed, because trip meters may, either you have always a right authorization or something like that, and then maybe you don't have a service for that, but either from the app or as a developer, you might want to use invent the same protocol. If it is either something like from this MQTT WebSocket HTTPS, internally in a vehicle, some IP, or some, gRPC is maybe not a protocol, but a framework, something like that. So one thing that I see is that you might want to have both VSS specifications and VSC service specifications, and in the end, get them down to the same protocol or framework. Most likely, you want to use the same authentication model. You want to use the same, like if it's HTTPS, you want to work against the same server, most likely, if you want to access a service, or if you want to set something. This is about resource addressing, that you want it to be similar. And potentially, we could see yesterday, Dirk Slama showed a bit of Digital Auto, where they used Python. Come on. No. Yeah. Where we used Python to show what you could do with VSS, and similar to what you could do with Python. This is some dummy code, definitely not Python, potentially not not correct in another language as well. But let's say that you, from a developer perspective, you're sitting there doing your internal function in the vehicle computer, or potentially even in the app. You might want to have it so that it's, for you, doesn't really matter if it's VSS or VSC that you want to work on. Let's say that this is very hypothetical, that you would like to play around with a horn. If you would have in Python or some other Go, Rust, C++, Java, whatever language you want, if you want to use the same, so to say, way with name completion to be able to see everything that you could do with a horn, like vehicle, you write vehicle to body but horn, and then you do a name completion, and then you can see that you can use VSS signals like is active to put on the horn. You could also potentially use, if you have some VSC services where you, for instance, could play a melody. And that is one form of alignment that I could potentially see in the future. And this is, of course, just code, but similarly, if you would be working with the HTTPS interface, with a this-like approach to access things, maybe you also want to have it very similar for VSC. Let's see if we have. And how? Well, some of my thoughts are, because if we are going to have, you have, as of today, VSC as its own little part, which is used then by this. You have, VSSO, the ontology there, linked a bit together, and we have VSC. But how can this be, in one way, interlinked? Well, one is, at some point, that you generate some common files. And when I say common files, that could be either some other description like Franca, gRPC, BAM, something that is used by another framework. But it could, of course, also be so that you take VSS and VSC and join them together and generate a header file in C++, Rust, whatever. And if we look a bit on this, because that is so far I think the only standardized way of so to say, accessing VSS. Is that the correct description of?
I think so too.
Yes. And there is, for the use case when you have MQTT, WebSocket HTTPS, since we have this too, and that is a W3C standard, if one would like to support VSC also, the MQTT, WebSocket HTTPS, it would be an advantage if it would be aligned with what we have in this, so that it could be used. So that was a bit of what I prepared here to sort of start the discussion of VSS and VSC and how it potentially could be aligned. Is there anyone that want to bring up some thoughts or your view?
Well, I think, as I interpret your view in the presentation, I can agree and go along with that. Absolutely. I mean, I think it's crucial, really crucial, that we get an alignment so that we have a set of standards, a set of tools to do vehicle communication, both in vehicle and vehicle to cloud and so forth, that are based on. Jump between VSS and VSC without having to know two completely different paradigms, so to say, that they are based on the same paradigm, being VSS. I think that's very important. Now, VSS is already based on VSS and is not very likely to change. And I mean, it feels like that is where we all want to go. So my question right now is, how far away, and maybe that question is to you, how far away is VSC from being able to have VSS at the base and build on top of it? You can be absolutely build on top and add more stuff, but at the very bottom, it's VSS.
From my point of view, I definitely agree to that. But where we are standing currently, I think that's what we're currently discussing and trying to figure out, like what's the best connection to VSS and how to integrate it into VSC. So I think we haven't concluded on that yet, and that's exactly the discussion, how to make that happen.
Yes, absolutely. So that's a good start, because you seem to be open at VSC to try to reach that goal, and that's a very good start. So then the question is how we get there. I don't have that answer right now.
We looked at your slides again, I guess, different options. Make sure that everyone understands the options and give their feedback.
Shall we do that?
Well, at some point, I think.
You mean now or?
At some point.
No, I would prefer to see the options which are currently discussed, since
Perhaps it depends on who was here yesterday, where we sort of opened up the topic a little bit and said, these are the options, and let's discuss more tomorrow.
But if there is an overview, so perhaps.
Yeah, if you have them available, or you.
I don't know if there needs to be an overview also of the VSC, or people understand what it is. So.
But the challenge, from my point of view, would be that agree on which methods we try to do. So play melody, play volume, play whatever, and we have to
right.
parameters, right?
So what is the we have to define the topic first.
Yeah.
Okay. The topic could be discussing the VSC language and capabilities, Or the topic could be the standard, what are the standard
let's see if I-
services we want to define?
That's how you
already done,
infiltrate.
so-
Yeah.
And, no, but
Just plug it in.
the room has to decide.
I-
What was on
I-
here currently is how does VSS and VSC work together, which is also a separate topic.
So which one is the preferred one?
You know,
Okay, this was
technically
solved.
speaking. So just decide which one you want to discuss. So.
It's the biggest ones.
Yeah, I think so.
I would maybe show, I mean, there is a proposal here to,
That's the wrong one.
guys, there is a proposal to generate something out of VSS into the VSC language. Maybe it's worthwhile just bringing up the GitHub to show the properties in the language so people understand what we're talking about there.
You mean the properties in VSC?
Yeah. Because that is what would be translated into, it's the only one that matches the VSS. So,
You mean the actual in the
well,
In the readme.
I think everyone in the room has to have some vague idea of what this descriptive language is, and then if everyone has that, then we can move on. But then there's also specifically the properties that I think would be the ones that we would translate into for that choice.
Even a little bit more.
So as if we take just a short, what is VSC as of today? And we can say in general with VSC that the syntax isn't as stable as VSS. It's still work in progress. We are awaiting some extensions, for instance, to be able to return streamed, multiple returns like progress reports on command. But in general, quite easy to understand. Not that you can define structs, so you can have structured data. This is something that you can't really do in VSS as of today. There is mostly a focus on simple data. Let's move over the struct. You can do some form of type def or syn types, for instance, to say that a type is limited in one way. Like here, you have a movement that can go from -1000 to 1000, but the base type is still an int 16. There is support to have enum-like constructs. And then comes the actual, services, and that is methods like here you have a move method. You will specify that you want to move, in this case, a seat. You can have in parameters, you can have out parameters. You can have also specify what type of errors that could be returned, like in this case, that it's okay or completed or interrupted. In addition to methods, let's scroll over there. There is something that's called events. This could be used, for instance, for subscriptions style or progress reports. It's generally that's something that you get like seat moving, and then you get some status information of it.
In this case, what is the intended difference to VSS, since I can subscribe to, okay, this position is achieved as well?
You can subscribe in VSS, and partially it is, I would say it's overlapping. The parts where it could be different is first when it's important that you have a unified set of information. Because in VSS, like a typical case is like you want to have both position of something and, let's say, speed at that same time. As of today, you can't by default not in VSS specify that I'm interested to get this sort of pair. Theoretically, you could potentially handle it further down, that you like always include the last position, but this about grouping data together when it's important to have things together. You have a little bit support by an aggregate keyword in VSS, but that is on, well, on branch level. So an event, like if you have some very different data from different places that you need, but it's very important that they are from the same time, that could be handled by VSC, could not easily be handled by just having VSS. But it's this thoughts, I think that you come to the presentation, like if you will represent VSS and VSC, well, a subscription could of course be represented as an event there. And finally, still up for discussion here, you can see a bit of question marks that VSC intend to support properties as well, where you can have this attribute sensor, these type of things too, so that theoretically what you have in VSS, a VSS model could be fed into VSC. Maybe, I assume you don't want to duplicate it, but it could be like, for instance, dynamically generated, populated. Do you want to take your presentation? Or?
We can look at the slides to see.
Which is it?
I'm not sure. I think this one.
Yes, we want to.
Okay, so yesterday we started a discussion to.
Yeah, might be.
That's not your latest one, because you changed translator to generator.
Oh yeah.
It was a minor change.
But let's keep it. Okay, yeah, yesterday we started the discussion to talk about like how could we integrate VSS into VSC, and from a tooling point of view we started to look into the topic like how could this two specification come together for generating like a stub code to access data in the end. Here you see the idea that we can somehow create out of the VSS specification some intermediate representation for VSC that is then joined with the VSC, and creating a VSC stub code to really access some kind of API. This is like one option we thought about, so it's just like two options on the slide. I will quickly show the next one. It's not all options we can think about. We yesterday thought or discussed that there are even more possibilities available. And here you could see like a different option that we keep like those two paths like really independent and do not merge those things together. So this is another option as well. But definitely there are different possibilities not drawn on the slides as well. It's just like to give you an somehow a start to the discussion. How could those two things be combined or kept separate in the end?
Did you decide for anything?
No, we didn't decide yet.
I think your slide with the translation layer is also quite useful because in one sense you're going up and down the stack. You know, if you think of VSS being closer, more southbound than VSC.
Do you think it makes sense? Is it touching the right topic here, or are we then going too far away from?
Well, to me, you kind of, okay. I'm just thinking, you know, you've got a higher, the API in one sense is a higher level of abstraction, and it's probably connected southbound to something that's nearer to a signal, but yeah, okay.
I have a question. You showed some YAML code here just before this, right? That, as I understand it, I might be wrong, correlates to the VSpec YAML file, so to say, if you want to try to correlate between VSS and VSC. VSC. I would like to see VSS in here, so to say. Right now I have not seen it at all, and I think, I don't know how, but I think those signals, I mean here you have some data that has, I believe, a one-to-one translation to VSS signals. You also have others that are not one-to-one and do not exist at all in VSS. So they should definitely, they cannot be represented by VSS in any way. But those that can, I think should in some way. How to do it, I'm not sure. But I think right now I don't see anything. VSS is just invisible in here, and I think it shouldn't.
Because we don't have such an example yet.
Okay.
And because we are right now discussing this, how and if it should be combined. So one way that I've described this scenario before is that you actually merge VSS and VSC into like one project and say we make one language that can handle both data and methods. That's sort of the extreme way of going to, then you would see everything in one place. Right? The other is what was on the slide, which is that you take VSS as a kind of input, you go through a tool, and the tool actually inputs it as properties in the VSC, so that you have the same source for the data, but when you use it in the VSC context, it is called properties, and which means you can use that definition to subscribe to it or do something with it. And the third option was to say, you know, we don't make it any connection, but the programmer has to know that this part described in VSC and this part in VSS, I need both, but I will write my program manually to use both of these features together. And that was the option 2 there. So that is basically the discussion. And then there are a few other options as well, that maybe you define a method, and then you just write in the method, you say, by the way, you should be aware of these VSS signals because they deal with the same area. So when you are implementing this, you should be referring to these VSS signals. And so there are many options here, and that's kind of really what needs to be worked out.
Yeah, and for me, to make my view on which would be the best solution, I would need to see a little bit more than really examples. Examples.
We need to see more, but also you can sort of
anyone can absolutely do.
Say, what happens if I write this here? What does it look like?
Absolutely. Everyone should try to contribute if they can find time. That's the main problem.
Yes.
Right now.
And I think, well, I see it on 2 levels, because looking at VSS and for that matter VSC, there are 2 levels. One is this about the actual syntax, the tooling, where you actually don't care about, well, that the signals of the services themselves are standardized. Another part of the next level is this, that you, well, what we currently have a lot in VSS about having a real catalog, and it's still to be shown for VSC to what extent we can sort of agree on that certain services are so, well, of common industry interest, and we can agree on it. In the past, we have seen that it might be difficult in some cases, like food and others, to sort of agree on how things should look like. But that, of course, doesn't prevent that there is a collaboration in the way that how you actually specify it, even if it would be so that all services are OEM specific. And as we look in this example, and this is just an example service so far, and we mention here with properties, and above we show that there are some methods to move a seat, to do some advanced features of a seat. These properties that could come from VSS, it could either be so that we just, as Gunnar said, at some point in time say that let's abandon the old VSS syntax, we just copy this one in here, or in the other direction, we take the methods and put them into VSS catalog for the services that we agree on. Could as well.
There could still be more than one input file. I'm just
Yeah.
saying that as a concept, there might be a way to say we're describing the entire concept in a consistent way, and it includes data and services.
Yeah, and it
It
could,
still be sort of separated in different files and different ways of doing it.
yes, and it could of course here also be an include statement that would go to the corresponding VSS file where we have like seat signals. This is for a single seat where we have this typical VSS data like is occupied and other things. So that I see as yes, as a tooling.
And also, I mean, VSS is so adopted that I don't think there isn't really an opening to make major change to that syntax today, or the way that it's described. It's probably optimized for its purpose in a way. If you put it into VSC, it becomes a little bit more.
In one way, yes. In one way, no. Christian, do you?
When we, so I still have the strong feeling that we need to use VSS. When I have a service, we somehow influence something which should reflect in the VSS, right? So even if I do VSC, I would be able to observe changing things in the VSS.
Yeah,
And this is why I really like to and I'm not so sure if we need more than just the VSS points, since when you define structures and you are completely free without using the VSS, then we just generate yet another standard, and then we are independent when we have services and I understand the structure and we need things at the same time, and this might be one thing we have to add, of course, but when we have a service and we want to change something, then the points we want to change should somehow be in VSS and should be taken from there. If they are not there, perhaps they are missing, or it's about timing, it's about something meta, whatever. So, but when I change the seat position, then it would, so I can say, okay, the position, what kind of access we take, but somehow it should be possible to access the same information in VSS. So it's.
I think that's true for many cases, Christian.
Yeah, but I still, so I also miss the link here. So complete. My feeling is only VSC is.
We're all missing the link. That's why it's on the agenda today.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
Yeah. But I just want to give you one counter example. What if you have a service that says, tell a joke to the driver? That is something that happens, and it isn't really reflected on the VSS
Totally fine.
signal. So I agree with you. A lot of the services will probably have data points that are reflected also in VSS, but there could be perhaps other services that are not reflected. So I think you have
happy to have
Yes.
both cases.
And one potential way that we have discussed internally, Christian is from Bosch as well as me, is that in some cases services might be what you expose, for instance, to an app, so that you can get sort of user-friendly error messages, where the actual service implementation is then the engine or that does something like move the seat, which then, and it's a service implementation, but maybe have this sort of logic of what to do if the seat is stuck, if there is someone behind it, if by some reason there is likely a problem with one of the engines in the seat, so it doesn't really ends there. This sort of logic that you only should try for 20 seconds, this sort of, if you want to move the seat to a certain position, at what speed should it be moved? And also things like potentially a little bit, let's say, safety related, like and I'm not trying to say a little bit safety related, because if we have a service, when we are talking about service implementations here, so far I haven't heard that many saying that they wanted to run on ACL B, CD, something like that, but still, like if you want to move a seat with your app, you wouldn't want to get a user-friendly error message that say that please wait until you have stopped the car. And you don't, because if you just go to VSS and you try to do a single set there, well, in some cases most likely will just not react, because you will just ignore the move seat, because somewhere there will be a safety guard that just, but you will most likely, if that is handled by some, CAN or some other protocol, don't get any real reply there. You just won't move. and that's not good for the user but then a service could, so to say, have that sort of check.
I think what you say is fully valid, absolutely. But I think move seat is also an interesting example, because at the end, move seat, all signals that are involved there, I believe, are already or should be in the VSS tree, right?
Yes.
All, basically all. But they must be treated in sequence and with intelligence, just as you described here. And so I think in the YAML description of move seat, I think VSS should be very visible, because it's really based on those signals to sensors and actuators around the seat. And I didn't see that directly, and so that is, I believe I know VSS fairly well, but I get a little bit lost here, and I would like to be able to use the knowledge I've built up around VSS when I get into this. It would help me so much, and then probably others also.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure, absolutely.
I think there's been now arguments to say services are needed.
Yes.
Is everyone agreeing on that
Yes.
part? So we can sort of move beyond that. And because there are also, as we know, there are some that say, I will never use the actuators on VSS because I believe you must use methods in order to do actuators. And so we have these different viewpoints, and I think we need to create the technology to be able to choose either or depending on them. So we agree on that part. And then there's the question, definitely that is why it's here, is that the same topic is likely to be reflected on VSS and VSC side. And how do we make that the best way? And maybe there are more options, but this is like the minimal option. This one is basically saying the programmer has to look into VSS and VSC and understand what are these things that and use both of these features, and they might still succeed, you know, in finding that these signals actually tell me the seat position, and this method is used to change the seat position, and I should be calling the method, and then I should be looking at the signals to understand the result. But that is a programmer doing that in this case. And the question is, of course, can we do something more advanced where we actually connect it together?
Yeah.
I think you have
And
to.
so that's option one, but there probably, I think there are more variants of these options. I think we have 3 or 4 probably.
If I understood it correctly before from Erik, what you've been showing is that wasn't this option, but it was more the option like I have the VSS as I have now. I have VSS tooling, but instead of generating this VSS stub CVP, whatever it is, it actually would generate the VSC input, right? I mean, I probably prepared a picture for that. Sure.
It's this one, I think, more or less.
Because that, I think, I mean, at least on PowerPoint level, I mean, as Rolf said, I mean, on an example, it's easier, but I think that looks good because it would mean that if you go this path, first, on day one, you would have 750 primitive VSC services already. I mean, granted, except error handling, they couldn't do much more, right? You could open trunk, raise window, but you would have that already and expressed in VSC. And then if you add these services you talk about, like the more complex, like tell a joke, move the window at this speed, and all this kind of stuff, then it is a point where for the programmer will look the same. I mean, either he calls a primitive method generated from VSS, or he calls a more complex method. And I think that is, from a developer point of view, I mean, I would like to use this as, if I have a quote here.
I love it.
Wouldn't it make sense to actually detail out the 2 examples, like with move seat or some situation, and then say this is this, this is this? I think in the first one you'll end up with a mess if you leave things up to you don't do this. This is my opinion. But I
The
think
first one is option 2,
The-
and the
the-
second one is option 1.
yeah, they want that one. Yeah. So to me, we should blow it out and basically just, look at the reality, like Ulf says, kind of look at the specifics. And maybe it's probably gonna be wrong, but I mean, that's the way to move it forward.
Yeah, and we have around 10 minutes left. I think it could be good, since we're anyway in tooling, just to briefly mention a bit what we have today. Because this picture, well, if you don't care that much about this part, this is a little bit what we have today. In vehicle signal specification, we showed a little bit about the Git repo. We have a tools repo where we have today some, well, the VSpec file, you can convert it to CSV, you can convert it to JSON, we have a Franca converter, we have, I think, do we have a protobuf as well? We have a handful of tools that various organizations have contributed that, mostly is just converting to some other representation. That is what we have today. I do not know if there is anyone, haven't heard about anyone doing anything more. There are some restructuring going on there. Sebastian did some restructuring yesterday while we others were drinking beer. But there we have some tools for vehicle service specification. There is a framework based on Jinja where you can write templates to convert from VSC to other parts. It has been internally tested in various companies to convert it to other, like protobuf, gRPC, BAM, other methods. So that exists when it concerns tooling. And when it comes to tooling, I know that you from Ambition, you have some ambitions. Ambition have ambitions to generate something. I'm not sure if have you talked about what ambitions you have there in.
Yeah, I think we touched the point yesterday in the discussion about like the VSC. Basically, our goal is that we want to describe like our full communication in VSC. We are doing with our like infotainment system and the rest of the vehicle in such kind of a service catalog. It's like some IP based, and so we only have methods there, even if we just exchange signals. So it's just like how it's working, and yeah, there we will need to have some kind of tooling around available, and it's not just like somehow converting the interface definition or like the services from the service catalog into like some other interface definition languages like Franca or something like that. It's even that we want to generate like the code out of the specification right directly with some like deployment files we want to add to that we have all the information available and can feed that into like a Linux-driven development environment and additionally into like some more AUTOSAR-driven environment. So this basically links to what we have heard in the talk from the AUTOSAR colleague as well, that this area is somehow opening up and trying to engage with the vehicle API concept. And so this is like the direction we are looking into, somehow integrate the vehicle EE architecture driven from AUTOSAR within our infotainment domain that is completely Linux driven. And so how to interconnect this. And this is where we see VSS and VSC as like one potential to have a common source of like data model or like service catalog we can use for.
I'd like to make a point on this picture, as you said. I mean, one thing to consider is that people are used to VSS, using only VSS and VSS tooling, and as was pointed out, which kind of suggests to me that the top part of this picture will always be there. Even if you went for option one, there's still that if you need only data, you would not convert it to VSC. If you only need data, you would use VSS and VSS tooling. So in my view, it feels like that will remain as a track, right?
But then this picture is confusing, sorry.
Yeah, it suggests that this picture is kind of true. Yeah. Also, if you go for option one, and so it's a little bit difficult to know. Maybe there isn't one answer to this question. Maybe we need both of these capabilities, and somehow decide on different cases. I'm not sure.
I think the point is you're saying, Gunnar, is that we shouldn't force someone who's using VSS to switch to VSC in the future, so that everyone can keep to like using VSS as they are like used to it and as they are like, and offer like VSC as a as a potential like evolution or add-on, or like some kind of like considering methods as well, and just including VSS, but not forcing someone to really switch to something different. Yeah.
Yes, and I totally agree, because as I see it, this is one potential integration or deployment option. Yeah, you had the other one as well, but this about using VSC tooling, and my interpretation here of VSC tooling is that it's tooling that either is open source as part of Covisa, like what we have it today with the Python and the Jinja templates or something, but of course also could be proprietary. Could be something from Bosch, could be something you use internally but works on. And that is, of course, the decision for each company to decide if it makes sense to have it open source, or something that you want to have internally. But then, of course, you have if you have other framework you are using, let's say AutoSAR, gRPC, whatever, where you don't want to generate your own code, you instead want to convert it to something else. I think there will, in the future, will be multiple different use cases. And as I see it, it doesn't prevent anything, because in the same way as we already today with VSS have a handful of different converters, we most likely have a handful of different converters in the future as well.
That's true. The key question is defining the language, the VSC language capability, and if there should be some kind of recommendation or rule in there that this must be a VSS signal and written like a VSS signal, and if that connection is actually spelled out in the specification, because that's the core question here, I think.
Yes.
Stephen?
Yeah, just something, a comment to put on the docket, on the task list. I think it's too early to have any strong answer at the moment, but VSC is going to need authorization, and therefore you're going to have to integrate to the authorization system on VSS as well.
Yeah, most likely you want to have the same, but as we said before, VSS in itself doesn't say anything about authorization. It's the implementation of this potentially. Yeah, of course.
These are layers that you add on to it. But one thing we haven't mentioned is the namespaces. Of course, you have hierarchical namespaces, and we could discuss about, if we recommend that those namespaces are the same as the vehicle branches, the VSS branches, in order to have some kind of name connection between here's the service, and you had that in your example, of course, with the horn. And so I assume for many access control solutions it would be kind of similar, that you have some kind of matching that these set of signals or these sets of methods belong to a group, and then you have permission to do that. And it could be done in a very consistent, same way. Whatever you choose, it could be done very similar in VSS and VSC, I assume.
Yeah.
And this about authorization, we will have continue at 1:15 discussing VSS layers, which authorization is a little bit one potential part of that. Because to summarize, if some of you would do something, how does this evolve? Well, we have 2 weekly meetings. We have Mondays, 6 o'clock European, or when that you have VSC meetings? I think it's 6 o'clock European time.
6:30?
6:30 maybe, yeah.
Maybe, I don't know. It's been
Mondays, evenings, European time at least. We have VSC calls on a weekly basis where Tim plays a big role. Tuesdays at 4 o'clock European time, we have VSS. And feel free to join if you have ideas, and because, Covisa in itself doesn't have really any development resources, so it's about member contributors that does things, and whatever tooling you have, and feel free to.
7 p.m.
7.
Is it 7?
CET, yeah.
On for
Mondays, the VSC.
Ah, is it 7?
I get moved.
Yeah, but
So, but one thing should be clear. I'm gonna mention it somehow. Is it always VSS and what should be in VSC, since we need one point of truth, right? When it comes to signals and so on, similar to VSSO, it's kind of clear where it comes from. When I want to change the thing regarding ontology, I do it at W3C, and if I change some semantic or whatever, I do it at VSS, and similar we need for the VSC, I guess. Otherwise, when the C position is in VSC and VSS, and at one point in time they will go far away. So is there already a statement like that? Or so that we all have the same understanding? That's
We made a statement like
No,
that.
but for the foreseeable future, if you are interested in, let's say, changing vehicle speed, it is VSS where it is being discussed. And when it concerns VSC, we have not yet come to really have any standardized services. We have a seat service, but it's just an example service. At some point in time, if I sort of get, well, if we come to have really standardized seat services and seat signals, then they might need to be discussed in the same forum, because then it's just a technical issue whether it's handled by a signal or so. But at that time, we might need to structure it different to have more like framework discussions and catalog discussions.
but I don't want to have.
That's also why we have this, we have the CVII sort of umbrella project, is order to realize these are so connected that we cannot let them just develop on their own.
So,
Yeah, and I
isn't
think-
it also that there should be a decision or a direction to define that VSS is the superset of data source? And then based on this superset, services can be derived. So if this is one paradigm to go into, then I think some of the following steps and decisions are much clearer.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
I think though I think in those cases where you have a very tight integration, I think that can be quite clear. But then, like Guna said, you might have a service which, you know, either doesn't touch the data particularly, or at least the VSS data much.
But
if
it's
at all,
fine
and
with
then it
service.
will become very.
Yeah.
It could be just some very high
But it will be
microservice.
pretty close, I think. I mean, we'll probably find some data that is related to.
But that's the point. If you
Yeah.
don't have
There
such
will
an
be some
understanding,
exceptions.
then there will be a
We will
very narrow.
meandering around, so what's the
Yeah.
option and so, but if you have this fundamental mindset jointly from the
Yeah.
beginning, then things become maybe much more obvious with architectural decisions further down the
I
road.
think so. But then the next step would be if you actually tie it together somehow in the syntax rules, saying that this must be a VSS signal. If you write it into the VSC,
Yeah.
then it becomes even tighter, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're discussing a little bit now, is there a technical solution or definition that,
But is there any thing hinders us starting with that? And if we come to a service where this is a no-go, then we
Yeah.
just, okay, discuss this again? But
right now, I think it's pointing towards that there are two types of properties. One is a VSS signal, and this really is the same thing as what is defined there. And the other is a non-VSS. And the reason I say that is that currently the language allows for complex data types and properties,
that's fine, yeah.
which the VSS does not. And so,
But even that can be done. I really are afraid that we repeat the complex driver story from AutoSAR, and nearly everything can be done as a complex driver. And this does not help when it comes to standardization, and this is true for XML and so many other languages.
yeah.
And this is when we have such a
But
Mindset.
based on what I said, where do we go? Do we introduce complex data types in VSS to make them the same?
No, you
Or
don't
do-
have to. You can do complex data types, but the things in the structure might be VSS signals. And then I don't care where in the VSS tree these things are hanging. But
Like you compose complex data type where you can say that, I mean, either you reference or at least the stuff in your complex data structure is following the same patterns as the
Yeah,
VSS
yeah,
signal,
yeah.
so to speak. that what we don't want to do in VSS could be done here, like
It's like a cool extension.
like make a nice struct of all the seat posters, right? I mean, in VSS with all these segments, like all these Williams actuators in there, and if that would be a struct or a subset of that,
But I feel, I partly agree, but I feel you're also a little bit mixing the concept of the data type and the actual data. Because the seed signals are actual data items. And the data type comes before that. Like in this language, you can define data types first, and then you can say, this property is using this data type that I defined earlier. And we don't have that in VSS. In VSS, basically, we are defining the type and the content in the same place, in where you actually do the definition, right?
But then we have to find a solution for that. So it's just
But
one thing to discuss.
it's not obvious what the solution is. Because there's a strength in VSS being simple. I don't usually propose.
But it's a fun part, right? So otherwise it's...
Yes. And I think that's something that we need to continue, because we will start again here at 15:15 in 10 minutes. So thank you everyone for participating. If you think it was interesting, the layer discussion will be about the same interest. So, well, we will see how many will come back.